Welcome back, everybody, to Two Guys in a Stack of Comics. My name is Reed. Along with me, as always, is Mike. Mike, we get to do one of our favorite things today. We get to analyze and talk about a comic book legend, one of our favorites. One, albeit with a complicated legacy, but probably indisputably the most influential comic book creator of probably the last 30 or 40 years. Not all time, that's Kirby, but this guy basically, the last 30 years or so, 40 at this point, all kind of defined by him. And so we will talk about probably my favorite comic book creator of all time, and Frank Miller. And then if I look at the evidence, my favorite three characters are Batman, Wolverine, and Daredevil. Batman, two of his greatest stories of all time are all Frank Miller. Daredevil's definitive run and Born Again are from him, and Wolverine's original miniseries with Claremont has the Frank Miller art. So, I mean, a guy who influenced so much of what is in modern comic books. Just an all-time great. We'll talk a little bit about what we think he did so well, what makes him a great storyteller. And Mike, I know you can bring a little historical context to Frank. So, as always, you're the comic historian on this. When I say the name Frank Miller, what kind of stands out to you about him and his career?
It's just iconic. Like what he did in the 70s and the 80s kind of paved the way for what comics would become. Writing the powerful scripts and telling the stories that he did definitely foreshadowed everything that was to come in the 90s as the comics went in a more serious direction. Um, Frank was a disciple, if you will, of the late great Neil Adams, who um, legendarily he used to come up to the studios where Neil worked, and Neil liked him, and he liked him because of his dogged nature. And Neil was someone who didn't take any quarter. He spoke his mind. He was famous for that. And people would come up to him all the time and say, "Hey, what can you help me, with my work? And I want to get into comics too," kind of thing. And Frank was definitely one of those kids as a youngster in the 70s. And Neil famously, tore him to shreds the first time he came up to his office, and said he thought Frank would just not come back. but Frank loved Neil, and the thing I think that Frank loved about Neil was his approach to Batman in the late 60s and the early 70s, and how he really brought that character back from a campy, ridiculous kind of character to somebody who was more ominous and serious and more grounded in reality. Neil's art style was certainly more grounded in reality, and the way he approached Batman in the 70s is now legendary, as to how he brought to life what would become the Dark Knight.
Yep.
Which, fast forward a few years later, Frank Miller took that on and carried it forward for all of us. But and that comic, and especially the Daredevil run, is so iconic because, like I said, it set up the tone for the way the comic book industry was going for the next few decades, because we were going dark. Comics were trying to write up to an older audience. We were the fans that were older, more mature, and we wanted those kind of stories. And guys like Frank Miller and Alan Moore, they delivered, in spades. All of those stories that we have now come to know as foundational were developed in that mindset.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about his career, I think his beginnings being kind of shot down is so interesting now, and that you kind of look at modern comic book creators who seem a little bit thin-skinned at times. Frank, when you hear about more about his interactions with Neil Adams, Neil was
You know
pretty
what?
blunt with him, like, "Man, you're done. This isn't going to work for you," and that he
But
overcame that
he
is
kept
really
coming
cool.
back, and that's what Neil loved about him. Is like he kept coming back and showing him more examples, and he was really trying to learn. And Neil admired that about him and saw his determination, and ultimately inspired him to keep going. But that first interaction with Neil Adams, from Neil's standpoint, it would usually just make or break him, because he was like, this is not an easy business to get into, and you got to have a thick skin. And I forget exactly his words in that interview when he was speaking about Frank, but he definitely admired his tenacity, and Frank kept coming back.
Yeah, I think the great thing that you can tell with him, I mean, his art is obviously not what it was anymore, but his original stuff, man, you go back and read that Claremont miniseries with Wolverine. Man, that's some great art in that comic, and the way he captured Wolverine as a character and kind of that sort of feral nature of the character, but that sort of twisted, like failed Ronin approach. He just visually brought a lot to that comic. You fast forward that to what he's mostly known for, and that is Daredevil and Batman. And I guess you start with Frank Miller. The first one that comes to mind for me is Daredevil more than Batman. And then I think Neil Adams to me is still the premier Batman kind of creative because of what he did. But Daredevil, there's no question. Pretty much everything that is in modern media about Daredevil is Frank Miller. When you look at, Bullseye existed pre him, but what made Bullseye a really threatening and terrifying character is Frank Miller introducing Elektra to the mythos, adding Kingpin, this kind of maybe sixth tier Spider-Man villain, and turning him into the perfect foil for Daredevil. There's just so much that he brought to the character. And I think the underrated piece of Frank Miller from Daredevil's perspective, the storytelling is so brilliant. But I also think, sometimes it gets attributed to its just darkness. And I think one of the great things is if you read Daredevil Born Again, while it's a dark story, there is this undercurrent of optimism at the end that carries through. And I thought that was what Frank Miller always did so well is Alan Moore always kind of felt a little more depressing. Like the end of
Right.
the story got worse and worse and worse. And it was still fascinating to see, but it was more like watching a car wreck and you knew it wasn't going to end well. Whereas Daredevil, he always delivered on there was just enough optimism, enough hope that no matter how disparate things got, you were like, it's gonna come out the other end. And that was what he did so well. And it became like the defining characteristic of Matt Murdock was this guy who can just get beat to shreds and he's always going to come back up and come back through. I think
It was
Daredevil
it was kind of
is
like the
among
it
the
was kind of
greatest
like
stories
this
because of that. Go ahead, Mike.
it's kind of like the Spider-Man story, right? Like Peter Parker always gets knocked down, but
Mhm.
the way that keeps the stories going forward is that there's that glimmer of hope.
Yeah.
He does get to succeed sometimes.
Well, and he did such a good job of just making you care about the characters around Matt. I think Daredevil Born Again, this is your last image of that, supposedly depressing comic is him completely, getting back with Karen after Karen destroyed his life, essentially. And that's what I liked about Frank Miller is, at least with Daredevil, he could plunge him into the darkness, take him to his lowest level, but you never lost the soul of the character. And I feel like, sometimes we attribute what he did to deconstruction. And I think that's a little more there with like stuff like Dark Knight Returns. But with Daredevil, I don't really see deconstruction. I actually see him like, hey, how much can I push this character to show how great the character is? He's tearing Matt Murdock down, but really to build him up stronger. And it's such a great job that he did with that. I think you look at Elektra as a creation, it's kind of insane that Elektra was created, 80s. She gets thrown in there. She's probably the definitive Matt Murdock love interest at this point. It's kind of like how Mary Jane overtook Betty Brant and Gwen Stacy, where it was just like, no, Mary Jane became it. It's kind of crazy because you have so much time where Elektra is not even part of the Daredevil story. And then the second she appears on panel, it's like it's an instant game changer. And we always sort of associate him with Daredevil. You forget how influential he was with a character like Elektra, who herself has become a massive part of Daredevil comics. You kind of spin off to Batman Year One, and I know Mike, that's one of your favorite Batman ones. I know last year they facsimiled that, got a chance to reread that. You touched on how Neil Adams kind of took Batman out of the Bam Biff Pow Adam West era and sort of threw in a lot of, I would say, almost James Bond-esque elements with like Ra's al Ghul and Talia and all that. Frank sort of takes it to another level. When you examine Frank's work with Batman, what stands out to you as a reader of the books, and what did you appreciate about that?
Well, especially in year one, where you get this kind of gritty cop story, that you would get from like a noir, like pulp novel. And the way it was treated was just completely different than other comic stories. There was real emphasis on character development and just a depth of in like 4 issues, like how
And we're
you
not
could,
talking like a year-long run. Yeah.
yeah, in just 4 issues. That just shows the mastery of the craft. And and Neil was definitely the master of that craft. He was someone who loved the medium, like Will Eisner, who understood the full scope and power of the medium. And Frank Miller, was the next generation of that, where you have the power of the words and the pictures together, and how you can create a panel that shows a character's despair and on their face, as well as the scene that you've crafted. Sometimes just the way he drew a character, like I just have this visual image from one of the panels of Gordon just kind of like slumped over, and the camera angle is from above, and so he looks kind of small and like beaten down, and it just adds such gravitas to the storytelling when you're in command of both. The When you're in command of a story like that and you're working with a good artist, I'm not sure how much of that was directed by Frank, but it was just a great gritty story that really made you care about even the secondary and third level characters.
No, I think you bring up a great point. It's almost cinematic in its presentation with what he did with everything in there. And what I loved about his Batman Year One, especially, it's a very small scale story. Like it's largely over a couple days. It's not some huge stakes. Gotham's gonna blow up kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing. But it feels epic, and I think that is what Frank Miller did such a great job of. Is in this modern age of comics now, where everything is the dark multiversal whatever crisis of the crises, because they don't know how to ratchet the tension. Both Daredevil Born Again and Batman Year One are really actually kind of small scale stories about personal stakes. And Batman Year One, it's such a great origin point for Batman. I love, those original issues where he's kind of just dressed in like the camo jacket and his initial attempts at being Batman. And I think that's what Frank always did so well was he wrote believable versions of the character that still felt consistent with the superhero ones. Another origin one he did, Daredevil Man Without Fear, after Born Again and all that, that miniseries with John Romita Jr., where he touches on Daredevil's origin. It's another perfectly framed kind of thing. It's actually sort of a smaller scale situation, but that's the thing that Frank always did so well is when you're reading these events, like you said, Gordon, the stakes for Gordon in Batman Year One, you can
Yeah,
sense the dread and how much everything is weighing on him. And that was so cool because it was like, it's this framing device to show how much this guy who's desperately trying to stay a good man is just being beaten down by this city that is so oppressive. And he never, I think the cool thing that he always did is the Batman piece is always great, the Daredevil piece is always great, but you're equally as invested in the Elektra piece of the story or the Jim Gordon piece of the story. And he wrote the characters in ways where they're flawed in believable ways, right? Like, I don't really love that he had Jim Gordon cheating on his wife, but the way that he wrote it, even Gordon himself kind of hates himself for it. Like, at least he had the foresight to write those things in there. And again, I'll say even Batman Year One, while you can talk about it being a dark comic, and it certainly is, what Frank does so much better than I think the modern deconstruction thing is, deconstruction now is just destruction for no reason to see like how much negative stuff can I put in here. Frank always felt like there's the end goal of where I'm trying to build the character. And like those framing devices we always used to get in like the 2000s movies, like the Spider-Man movie with Raimi where he swings through the city, even the Daredevil movie with Affleck, where at the end he jumps off the building and throws up the grappling hook. Frank always had that last shot, that last scene that felt like a movie close kind of thing. Daredevil Born Again has that brilliant frame of like the costume evolving to the modern day. He just did such a great job of a reader, of gripping you instantly, and in 4 or 5 issues telling something that felt like it was a dozen issues. And I think he also was so great at you always wanted more. And I think he understood. He reminds me, and this is an obscure reference, it reminds me of Seinfeld. Seinfeld was a TV show that ended perfectly, not the last episodes, but Seinfeld never had a season where you're like, oh, they've lost it. When you
Yeah.
watch Seinfeld, you're like, man, I wish there were more episodes, but they kind of knew we don't have anything great left. Everybody's going to enjoy every season. And that's what I think Frank did so well was his Daredevil run, his Batman stuff,
And you
except for
talk
some of the sequel series. Now, you always wanted more, and that made it so great.
you talk about the cinematography. This is a little bit obscure, but do you remember? I think it came out in the '90s. That movie Sin City.
Yes, like, I think yeah, early 2000s. Yeah,
Yeah, and that was a Frank Miller storyline and everything. I don't know if it was it a comic.
yeah, it was yeah, he did. So
Yeah.
Sin City was a comic. He's had some other ones. What was Ronin was the other one. I think 300 is his too. I mean, he had a lot of success outside of Marvel and DC too in terms of his ability to create stories that were just great on film.
And that was
I
great. That storytelling in Sin City, and I guess I missed it when it came out in comic form, but I remember seeing that movie and going, "Oh my gosh, I got to get that graphic novel," and
yeah,
because it was really,
he he really seemed like the evolution of what Stan Lee wanted, and that like Stan Lee always talked about, I want to make the comics sort of cinematic and make them easily adaptable for things. Frank Miller seemed to perfectly do that. But the greatest thing is he never compromised the comic for it. I
yeah,
think now we have folks where they're writing the trade for a movie, like, oh, here's a cool little 6 issue series that would make a perfect movie. And it feels ripped off as a comic fan, like, oh, you were trying to make this adaptable into a 90-minute film.
yeah,
Frank wrote those stories. You never once, as a comic reader, were like, oh, we felt ripped off. I think you can talk a little bit about some of the stuff at the end that he did. Dark Knight Returns is interesting in that is a lot of people's favorite Batman story. I will say I do love the Batman pieces of that story. I hate Superman's presentation in it. But again, it sort of starts a trend of the everyone now has their Dark Knight Returns for their character. He kind of pioneered it with that. That story to me is so interesting in that what I will always give Frank Miller credit for, despite not loving that quite as much as everybody else does, I will always say his character growth that he does when he drives into the darkness, he picked characters that what happens to them feels like natural extension of where the character could go. Right.
yeah. And I think that's where a lot of folks miss the mark, that are trying to come after Frank Miller, because Frank Miller is a genius, and he's a true craftsman, and he can take these characters and break them down and bring them back up and do it really, really well. But like we've said many times, it feels like a lot of times, since he was the trendsetter, the original one to really do that, um, folks are just trying to piggyback off of it and trying to do it with characters that really don't work, um, and it shows, and it comes off just you end up just
It's a
degrading the
pale
character.
imitation. Yeah, it comes. his selection, like Daredevil, absolutely, Daredevil's book gets a lot darker when Miller takes over compared to, the early stuff with like Stan Lee. But what I will always say is, as someone who's read, I think almost every single issue of Daredevil at this point, it does feel like a natural extension. Like Matt going to where he is with Miller, it's not like, whoa, man, that's a really weird place that this went. If
No,
you read Matt's story, it's like this was all building to it. And yes, there is a tonal shift, but it completely fits. Same
yeah,
thing for Batman. Because
yep,
of where Neil Adams and Denny O'Neil and a lot of the greats in the 70s that had Batman, Frank's shift into a little bit darker fits as well, where it's like, okay, this fits in alignment with it. He was great at selecting those characters. He didn't have Spider-Man for that. He didn't try to do that with characters where it didn't fit. We talk a little bit about kind of where his stories went eventually. And I think, stuff like The Dark Knight Strikes Again, the second one was a disappointment. And I think there was a Dark Knight 3 that came out a couple years ago that was a bit of a disappointment. But what I will say for Frank Miller is, like you mentioned, this is one of the all-time greats. His legacy, I think sometimes, and you and I did a video talking about our Frank and Alan Moore's legacy negative because of where they drug the medium. What I will always say, I feel way different about Frank Miller than I do Alan Moore. Alan Moore, while I love his stories, like you said, Alan Moore oftentimes expressed that he didn't really love superheroes. I
yeah,
think the really key difference with Frank Miller and Alan Moore, while they both wrote dark stories, Frank Miller loved Batman. Frank Miller loved Daredevil. And it felt like when he wrote those stories, yes, it was darker. Yes, it was more serious. Yes, it probably drugged the kids' medium into places that maybe it didn't need to go, but it was always shining through in his work that, man, this guy loves Batman. This guy loves Daredevil. I think the Punisher even showing up in those comics. Every character that he wrote, you could tell it came from a place of this is a guy who appreciates and loves these characters. And I do think that's why his works are a little more enduring than Alan Moore's. Is that Alan Moore, while he was dark, it's all the extra stuff like Watchmen that really stand out. Overall, Mike, Frank Miller's impact on comics for me, I have to say, as much as I will always say Jack Kirby's the king of comic books and the definitive, he sits the Michael Jordan of comics. He's the top. For me, I'd say you can't have a conversation about comics without talking about Frank Miller as one of the all-time greatest. I mean, he's in the top five, in my opinion, if you do anything about comic creators. Do you feel he's at that level, or do you feel like I'm overrating him a little bit?
no, he is way up there. I mean, and when you think back to the time frame that he burst onto the scene, it's almost like he came out of nowhere. But it's almost like he was the industry was waiting for him. And like I said, for someone who could set the tone for comics for going on 40 years now, I mean, that's a huge deal. That's a really huge deal. And you have to understand that, that somebody who can do that will always have a place, a huge place in comic book history. He helped guide the ship to where it was going to go. People kind of lost sight of the shoreline, but if you go back to his original, it was pointed in the right direction. You can't, and we've discussed this, a few other times. There are heroes that don't go dark very well, and being a good crafter of those stories and a good competent artist and creator like Frank is, he knew, like you said, you wouldn't go there with Spider-Man. You wouldn't really go there with Superman.
Yeah.
But choosing the characters that he did to express those stories, is part of the genius, and knowing how far to take it and when to bring it back. And I think a lot of modern creators who are piggybacking off of what he started, 40 years ago, have sometimes found it difficult, because it is you can't go dark like that on every character. You just can't. There are a few that it works, and Frank already did them.
Yeah, I think that's the thing is he cornered that market, and you and I talked a little bit about the legacy in that one video we did. I do think overall for Frank Miller, where I have to give him a ton of credit is just because other people are doing what he did poorly doesn't mean that his work is reflected negatively as a result. It's kind of like a filmmaker like Christopher Nolan,
Yeah,
where he makes a lot of dark movies. He's great at doing it. If you're a wannabe Christopher Nolan, it's not Christopher Nolan's fault that you can't do what he can do. And I
yeah,
feel like that's the same thing for him. I think the other thing is, I really will say, well, I critique the heck out of his appearance because I love Superman as well. I hate the Superman that appears in The Dark Knight Returns. What I will always say, Frank crafted that as an Elseworld story. That was never supposed to be the mainline Superman.
and it
And so
always
even
felt
the
that
thing that
way.
I dislike the most, he wasn't trying to make that as a statement on Superman. This was with a very specific, narrow focus on that world that he built for that one story. And it seems sadly that comic books didn't get that. It seems like they more went like, "Oh, cool, let's do that." It's like, no, that was only great because it was in this cordoned off kind
Yeah,
of set thing in
and it
in
was
the
being done by
text.
a true master of storytelling.
Well,
You
and where
know,
you can't hate that story, man,
yeah,
his ability to have Batman deliver monologues that are that the one man who beats you monologue that Super Batman gives Superman when he's beating him at the end of that book. I mean,
yeah.
again, I love both those characters. Batman's my all-time favorite character. That speech that he has Batman deliver when he beats Superman, even for a second, that's just incredible writing in
It
alignment with the
is right.
character. And we
Yeah,
don't get, I think that's the thing that's so sad with when you go back and read Frank's stuff. We just don't get comics like that anymore. Like we get some that are close, but not with the big two. And I think that is what is so special when I go back and look at his works is he understood the way as a writer to elevate a small scale thing to feel like the largest conflict in the world. And now I think because we can't match that, so many people just go, well, it can't just be all of Gotham that's in danger. It's the whole DC universe or the whole multiverse, or, well, we can't just write a great Joker story. It's now there's three Jokers, and everybody makes these pale attempts. And I think when you really go back and read his stuff, man, especially with Daredevil and Batman, it's
and,
such small scale stuff most of the time, but he makes it feel so grand.
yeah. It takes a true master to make the small feel huge and grand. And you're in rarefied air when you can do that, like Frank Miller, like Will Eisner could, and his little side stories, and they would just take you to another world, and you felt for those characters, and it became a big deal, even though it was just a tiny little slice of life somewhere in New York City or whatever Will Eisner was doing. Frank Miller could do that and make this the small things seem really really big. And you're right. The world doesn't have there doesn't have to be the crisis after the crisis after the crisis before the
Yeah.
next crisis. It would just you would have to
There's also the dark crisis follow up to
crisis
the
out.
crisis of the
Yeah,
crisis of the crises.
yeah, we're all crisis out. I mean, how many crises can you have? You can go back to the little stories and make them special and make them big, and the fans and the readers of this material will enjoy it just as much. But sometimes you got to have the chops. You got
Oh, and
to.
he absolutely always did. And I think last thing point here with it, he was also a master of integrating social issues and political topics at the time into his books, but doing so in a way that felt natural, that felt like an extension of the story, and that if you were looking for it, you could find, but if you weren't, you could read it and just go, man, that's a great comic. And I
Yeah,
think comics have really struggled to try to replicate what he did with that because right now they don't have the subtlety that he did. But man, hard to find a more master storyteller than Frank Miller. There's all kinds of controversies around some of his newer works, and certainly I think you and I can agree what he's done the last couple of decades hasn't quite lived up to his original kind of sweet spot that he hit. But man, when Frank Miller was knocking out of the park, there have not been many better than what Frank Miller was for the comic book industry, and we see that to this day with stuff like Daredevil and Batman, where all the time these cinematic adaptations, the video game adaptations, it basically all is pulling from Frank and what he did with those characters.
you can't take it away from him. I mean, he's still got it, and I will maintain that Frank is still at it. I mean, I know some of his more recent stuff, maybe, but I mean, when you think about it, he set the bar really high a long time ago.
It's sort of what's it? It's like Michael Jordan on the Wizards. Those years don't live up to the Bulls stuff, but the
Yeah,
Bulls stuff was so great. It's like the Wizards stuff doesn't detract from how
no,
great he was. And
no,
if there was a Batman Daredevil Hall of Fame, Frank Miller would have a banner in the rafters hung for what he did with the characters. He just did such great stuff. I would definitely say, folks, if you haven't checked those out, if you have only heard about Frank Miller's work, if you're a little disgusted with modern comic books, there's a great kind of Marvel's put this out recently. This is Born Again. They put it sort of like in a manga sized format. I think this only came up at like $13. It's a great collection of the Daredevil stuff. Batman Year One is very easy to find in reprints. If you have only heard about these stories and kind of seen them on lists but have never checked them out, it is absolutely worth your time. Whatever you are reading right now, I can pretty much guarantee it's not going to be as good as what you'll find in Batman Year One, Daredevil Man Without Fear, Daredevil Born Again, and pretty much any of those classics that Frank wrote. As always, folks, let us know what you guys think below. What do you think of Frank Miller and his legacy for comic books? Do you think he's a top 5 creator all time? And what is your favorite Frank Miller work? Let us know down below. As always, folks, thank you guys so much for watching. God bless you, and we will catch you in our next video.
thanks everybody.